We're here again with Mark Collinsworth of VERE Global Financial. And Mark, today you're going to tell us about how the repeal of Glass-Steagall really led to the crash of 2008 and other dire things that may repeat themselves again, because in effect, what we are doing once again is unregulating capitalism, right?
That is correct. So Glass-Steagall was originally put in place back in the 1930s. What had occurred that helped make the Depression worse was banks actually commingled their assets in the stocks, brokerage firms, and things like that. Glass-Steagall was put in place to separate banks and brokerage firm activities into two separate entities. Well, when 1999 rolled around, I guess a group of politicians got the idea, if we get rid of Glass-Steagall and actually allow banks and brokerage firms to commingle again, that will open up the door and allow more people to get homes. Well, what that basically initiated was, because you less restricted people that could get loans, you created what was called the ninja loan. That's no income, no assets. Those people then had the door open to obtain mortgages. Of course, it did help the housing market take off like a rocket, because people that could not previously get a mortgage were able to get mortgages. Unfortunately, they weren't able to pay their mortgages. And then by 2008, it had gotten so bad that the entire banking system started to collapse under us, and that resulted in Dodd-Frank, which was the replacement for the Glass-Steagall Act.
And before we get to Dodd-Frank, the repeal of Glass-Steagall led to the crisis in 2008, which included the subprime mortgage crisis.
Correct. The subprime goes back to those people that basically ninja loans, people that had no income and no assets. Subprime was basically designed to allow those people that had no reason to even have a mortgage loan to begin with. It opened the door for them to get a mortgage, and that's where your subprime came from. And the banks and the brokerage, the banks basically sold the subprime, and the brokerages basically sold it to clients.
So who was behind the repeal of Glass-Steagall? Democrats, Republicans, or both?
Well, Bill Clinton was the president in 1999 with I believe it was the Democrats controlled the Senate at that time.
So therefore, it was mostly ushered through by Democrats, and I suppose to the applause of the Republicans.
Well, for the Republicans, it's kind of hard sometimes when Democrats want things their way. It's kind of hard to say, when the Republicans make the argument, you can't repeal this act because it will create, a housing bubble, and then the Democrats come back and say, you don't want certain people to have a mortgage or have a home. You're trying to keep people under your thumb. It's very hard for people to do what's right versus the tricky words they're saying, if that kind of makes sense.
Now, did they know what this would lead to? Was it, an unwitting mistake on their part, or did they know that there would be a big boost for those who were in the stock market, for the big companies and all that, and eventually the chickens would come home to roost? Did they know that ahead of time?
This is the only way I can look at that. Either they knew it was going to happen, or they were so stupid and so ignorant to how things work in the financial markets, they had no reason to actually be an elected official. Because the second you got rid of Glass-Steagall, you basically took us back to you literally took the financial system back to 1929, because there was no regulations whatsoever. You literally was back in 1929 when Glass-Steagall was taken away.
And that's when, after the crash of 29, the depression that followed, that's when Roosevelt brought in these regulations, and also under the direction of Joe Kennedy Sr., and the quote with Roosevelt at the time, attributed to him anyway, is that, well, it takes a crook to catch the crooks, and Joe Kennedy knew all the tricks, correct?
Correct. Joe Kennedy was heavily involved in the mafia with the bootlegging whiskey during Prohibition, and Joe Kennedy was also very familiar with the different strategies on how to manipulate stocks, insider trading. He knew all of the tricks on how to steal money legally through the stock market. And of course, when he became the SEC chairman, he simply basically closed the doors on all the tricks he used to use.
So therefore, Kennedy Sr. and Roosevelt put these regulations in place after the crash of 29 to avoid another crash. And then when Glass-Steagall was repealed in what, 1999, that opened the door for a repeat of the same kind of stock market crash and wrecking of the economy.
That is correct.
All right, so after they repealed that, they replaced it with Dodd-Frank. Now, how did that work?
I don't think it's worked very well, and the reason why is you now have taken, like, I think Glass-Steagall was a very well written piece of legislation. It got the job done. It didn't go too far, but it did just enough to stop the problem from ever occurring again. What I think's happened with Dodd-Frank, it's gone way, way overboard. It's really clamped down a lot of restrictions on the banking system. To kind of give you an example, I'm sure you've heard the jokes, you know, if you need to borrow $10,000, you have to have $1 million to borrow $10,000. It's made it very hard for banks to lend money out because the restrictions are so hard. And I believe that's one of the reasons, you know, historically, after you come out of a big recession, you should have a huge rebound in the economy. Over the last 10 years, we've only averaged about 2.5% GDP. I think a big reason behind that subpar growth is because the Dodd-Frank regulations are so strict on banks. Banks are really limited to how much money they can actually loan out to stimulate the economy.
But is that preventing another crash? I mean, I heard all kinds of predictions that we're going to have another huge crash because, again, it's largely unregulated. So is a Dodd-Frank regulation a stop to that, or could it happen anyway? How is all this working together?
Well, I'll give you an example here, just here in the last several weeks, because of one of the regulations that Dodd-Frank actually put into the banking system. The Federal Reserve actually had to go in and override part of Dodd-Frank to actually allow banks to start loaning money out here just in the last several weeks. So that's kind of proof right there that Dodd-Frank is too restrictive, because if the Fed had not allowed that restriction to be removed, the stock market still could be tumbling right now. That restriction freed up hundreds of billions of dollars in bank assets that would have never been able to enter the system if the Fed hadn't stepped in and said, hey, you've got to kill this rig.
But even before the coronavirus created this current situation, weren't we headed for another breakdown because of, they're going to town again on all these crazy investments. The banks are like casinos. So Dodd-Frank is not addressing or stopping that, is it?
Well, the problem I have with Dodd-Frank is that there's so many loopholes in it. Technically, if a bank wanted to bypass a lot of the regulations, it could. The reason why banks don't bypass it is because they still remember 2008 and they don't want to. But Dodd-Frank really hasn't stopped the problem. It still leaves the door open if a person morally or unethically decides to pursue those doorways.
And more and more of that is going on, is it not?
Correct. You give it enough time, and eventually those people, the reason why we probably don't see it now is because the people in charge have learned their lesson from 2008 and just have chosen not to use those doorways. But here, let's say another 20 or 30 years, people that are brand new to the industry, like my children, they didn't learn a lesson from 2008 because I was 1 year old. What happens in 30 or 40 years when they're the president of a JP Morgan or a Morgan Stanley, and they decide to open up those doors not knowing the consequences of 2008?
So what's the solution? What is the proper direction here now? To reestablish Glass-Steagall or something like it, and to drop Dodd-Frank?
I think Glass-Steagall is perfect. I don't know why they spent all that time writing Dodd-Frank. Glass-Steagall had worked perfectly from 1933 to 1999. Why not just reinstall Glass-Steagall? Banks were already familiar with those regulations. It would have been an easy reintroduction. Now banks are having to learn a whole brand new set of rules, and we don't know how those rules actually will pan out in a recession. We've already seen just in the last few weeks that one part of the regulation has already caused problems during the coronavirus.
All right, so Glass-Steagall was rescinded in 1999. Then Dodd-Frank was put in place as a replacement for Glass-Steagall in what year?
2010.
2010. All right, so as it stands now, assuming we get through the coronavirus crisis and the economy begins to reopen, we still haven't fixed the problem that we are heading towards another big stock market crash. Have we fixed that problem to prevent another crash?
I think on this, what Dodd-Frank's actually done is Dodd-Frank has put so many restrictions in place that when the system starts breaking down, the system will not be able to respond properly as it did during, let's say, the 1990 recession, the 1980 recession, the 74 recession. There just won't be the same response because now banks' hands are tied on what they can do.
All right, and Dodd-Frank was put in. Well, Dodd was a Democrat. This was put in place because, I mean, what arguments did they make that that should be put in place after Glass-Steagall was rescinded?
Well, the big argument was that Glass-Steagall didn't go far enough with regulation, so they wanted to take it several steps further. One of the things that actually came out of Dodd-Frank that wasn't in part of Glass-Steagall was the Consumer Protection Agency, which basically had what required credit card companies to have to calculate your forecasted interest. There's a whole bunch of new regulations that came out to protect the consumer from credit card companies from Dodd-Frank.
So that's another area of concern. The high interest rates. When was that allowed? I mean, this would have been called usury in the old days. Now it's legal with credit card companies. The extremely high percentage rates that they charge. How did that come about?
Well, the reason why banks are now charging higher interest rates is the arguments is now they've been saddled with so much regulations from Dodd-Frank that that's an extra cost because they have to hire new regulation specialists and so forth and lawyers that to compensate themselves they have to raise interest rates to make up for that loss of profit.
Is that valid or a rationalization, an excuse?
That is probably a pretty good excuse. I don't think increasing interest rates by 300 basis points is probably overboard, but maybe raising interest rates maybe 50 basis points might be suitable to actually cover the additional cost.
So therefore, where should interest rates be? Where should it be where the credit market would be stable without being a predatory device to extract more money from the consumer?
Well, honestly, I think they should actually get rid of the Federal Reserve and actually let interest rates become a free-floating interest rate environment where the marketplace of where thousands and thousands of traders basically look at the economic data and determine where the fair rate of interest should be at versus a group of a dozen people sitting in a room once every 3 months deciding where interest rates should be at.
All right, Mark, last question. Considering the situation we're in right now in late April, uh, if the economy is reopened within the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, maybe at least in stages, is this enough for us to ride out this storm and for the economy to become restored once again, or is it still going to be tough sledding ahead, assuming that we reopen within 3, 4 weeks?
I still think it's going to be a rough going. For one reason, if you look at the inventory sales number came out yesterday, Friday, and that shows that companies are basically sitting on huge amounts of inventory that they haven't been able to sell. Of course, consumers aren't coming in there and buying. Well, when the consumer does come back, they're going to have to buy those products. But the manufacturing sector that still makes those products for that inventory, they're still going to be sitting here for a month to 2 months out before they see any new orders come in to actually be replaced. But that's not even the major problem I'm concerned with. What happens come, let's say, September of October of this year, and we're right back to where we're at with a second round of the coronavirus, which right now looks very feasible, and we're back into social distancing and all the businesses are closed from October all the way through April of 2021. What happens then?
What do you think will happen?
That will put us in a very dire situation.
To say the least. What's the probability of that occurring?
Right now it looks I'd say there's a very high chance of it unless they can come up with a vaccine or a cure before then, which that's going to be very difficult because, because of regulation and stuff. It takes at least a year once you actually get a vaccine. And right now, there's not even a vaccine out there. So let's just say by some miracle, there's a vaccine that we don't know about that all of a sudden pops up in, let's say, September. Well, in September, you can't inoculate 300 million people, let alone billions of people on the planet in a few months. To inoculate a few hundred million people, that takes years to do.
Yeah. And we may not have years. Mark Collinsworth, on that dire note, once again, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.